The following program is about murder. Some viewers may find certain scenes disturbing.
Good evening. I've brought you something. Let me show you.
What do you want? Who are you? What do you want here?
Why do you pretend not to recognize me? I was here twice before. I have another piece for you. Why do you pretend not to remember me? I can go someplace else. I have no time to waste.
No need to rush, sir. Are you not well?
It's a fever. I have not eaten. Not for days. I have another piece to show you.
What is it?
It's the silver cigarette case. I told you before.
Does not feel like one somehow. And it's all tied up. It's all tied up. Why did you tie it so?
In this 19th century drama, the resolution of the murder hinged upon extracting a confession. Today, however, after an actual murder, incriminating evidence, visible and invisible, at the crime scene, hairs, fingerprints, blood, footprints, should be collected and analyzed to help prove that a particular suspect is the killer. While what precipitated the crime, what led to the confrontation, should also be explored. The final solution, who did it and why, and how it might have been avoided, is the goal of science applied to legal investigation, forensic science, the science of murder. So far in this program, actors have played a drama. What follows is reality. While some sequences are reconstructed, all the situations are real. During this century, almost twice as many Americans have been murdered as have died in war. Last year, there were close to 20,000 homicides. Americans are killing each other at more than 10 times the rate of any other advanced Western civilization. While you watch this program, 2 people are going to be murdered. If you, the audience for this Nova, are a true sample of the American people, 368 of you will, within the year, die by murder.
Can we live with murder? I do not believe that we should, as a society, accept murder as a fact of life, in the sense that we do nothing about it. But I think it's reasonable today to say that murder is, in fact, a fact of life in our society.
There's no question that in a family where a murder has taken place and a member of the family has been murdered or has been a murderer, when one talks with those families, one is aware of the fact that the ripple effect goes beyond the primary family to the extended family, to the neighborhood, to the community, and in fact, to the entire city.
Murder is a blight on us all, and since 1965, the rate has doubled. Murder must be stopped, and murderers caught, but only through understanding who murders, how, and why might the rate be reduced. The need for effective forensic science is obvious. Its history is short. Harvard University in 1849 was a landmark. Here, a great benefactor, Dr. George Parkman, disappeared. Suspicion fell on Dr. John Webster, a chemistry professor, when pieces of bone and teeth were discovered in the ashes of his laboratory furnace. Parkman's dentist testified that the teeth fitted the missing man's jaw. In 1891, in Argentina, Juan Vucetich had it accepted that fingerprints are unique and unchanging. He classified them, and here, in 1892, the first murder case was resolved on fingerprint evidence. In 1910, Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was suspected of murdering his wife, Belle, when human remains were found in the basement of his house. But unless Mrs. Crippen could be linked with these fragments, nothing could be proved. Dr. Bernard Spilsbury became famous by identifying a scar on a small piece of skin as corresponding to a known surgery scar on the missing woman's abdomen. Dr. Crippen was hanged. Sacco and Vanzetti finally went to the chair in 1927 on the first indisputable ballistics evidence. But the key question was whether the bullets, finally produced in court, actually originated at the murder scene. Today, in the Forensic Science Laboratory, physical evidence collected from a murder scene, everything from bullets to blood, is examined and analyzed. And from this work is generated expert testimony to be given in court, which can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a defendant is guilty or innocent. The search for evidence usually begins with finding a body, a dead body.
Oh, officer, from homicide, what do you got?
The man shot inside. Witness thinks he heard 3 shots.
Was it a call from 9/11?
Yeah, no, it was cool.
Take a look at the scene. The crime scene unit and EME notified officer?
Yes, both.
Let me get some information from you.
The homicide detective takes control. He begins the ritual processing of the crime scene.
Identification at the morgue tomorrow? Thank you.
He has the crime scene unit photograph the area before the body is touched. A record of exactly how the scene is found is an essential scientific basis for reconstructing the murder.
I'll finish up, Rich, with an overhead of
Gentlemen, EME?
How do you do?
The medical examiner arrives at the crime scene to take charge of the body.
What have you seen so far?
Doctor, what we have so far is a wound in the back. We haven't touched the body pending your arrival.
It is she who confirms that the victim is dead and that it appears to be a case of homicide. It is she who examines the body for injuries.
Entrances here on the right front of the chest.
Okay.
And there's another entrance on the left. We see powder and burning around this entrance.
It's a contact, Arnie?
Yes,
Yeah, it
Rich.
appears to be a contact.
That's on the left upper chest.
Let's examine the wounds on the back again.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
This is her initial examination before she sends the body to the morgue.
Appears to be an
There,
exit wound.
it will be examined in detail and dissected at a forensic autopsy to determine the exact cause and manner of death.
All right, I see no other wounds on a preliminary.
There doesn't appear to be any rigor mortis as yet.
There appear to be a few hairs adherent to the hand. I think we should have the hands bagged.
Okay, doctor, we'll take care of that.
Let's check the other side. I don't see anything on this hand, but we'll bag both hands.
Okay, doctor.
Yes, doctor.
With the medical examination over, the location of every item in the scene is diagrammed as a prelude to the search for physical evidence, which could identify the killer, based on the premise that
no one can go physically any place without taking something with him from the place that he left and leaving it at the place that he went to. Likewise, when he leaves that place, if it were the scene of a crime, he should, in theory, be taking with him something physical from there.
the trained investigator will recognize what useful evidence could be at a crime scene. The killer could have left saliva on a cigarette butt, a good set of fingerprints on a glass, hairs on a hat, blood from a cut. But after identifying the possible sources of evidence, the investigator must protect them.
Evidence can be destroyed. If the person who committed the crime was smoking a cigarette, threw the cigarette into the toilet, if the toilet is subsequently flushed, we lose that as a piece of evidence. By picking up the telephone, we can lose fingerprint evidence because the person may smudge other evidence which would be there. Anything which destroys the integrity of that scene can contaminate or destroy potential evidence.
The crime scene investigators must preserve the integrity of potential evidence through the manner in which they locate, collect, and itemize it.
We found 3 cigarettes, Salem brand, and 1 Kent. We can send the hat to the lab for hair samples. With several strands of hair, then we can make a comparison. We'll mark that AR2.
Okay. FN 380, Arnie.
Okay.
Brass primer.
Right.
Looks good.
Okay, fine.
They package each piece, seal, and precisely label it, what it is, where it was found, and when. This prepares items to be passed along a chain of custody,
There we go.
from the crime scene
Okay,
to analysis at the forensic laboratory to presentation as evidence in court.
So physical evidence has existed all through. You remember out, damn spot from Shakespeare, right? But we feel it's necessary today because it is a departure from the more crude American methods of talking vigorously to suspects and perhaps even taking physical action with suspects in order to convince them perhaps that they should tell us all about it.
In this particular jurisdiction, the bodies of apparent homicide victims are brought to the medical examiner coroner's office. As with physical evidence, the body passes along a chain of custody. Here, before being prepared for a forensic autopsy, it is ritually itemized, recorded, weighed, and measured. The forensic autopsy is the detailed legal medical examination and opening of a body when the internal organs are removed and examined. This autopsy is performed by a medical examiner who is charged with determining a legal opinion on the cause of death and whether or not it actually is a case of homicide, with suicide, accidental, and natural causes ruled out. At the autopsy, the medical examiner traces the injuries, looks for abnormalities, and recovers evidence, such as bullets. He reports his findings and interpretations to the police and the courts.
I think the best way to describe an autopsy is that it is a laboratory test that can be carried out as a technician would carry out a laboratory test. In other words, there should be concern for the quality of it.
This man suffered a gunshot wound in the head. The autopsy we now show lasts only a few minutes. Some viewers may find it visually disturbing.
The initial investigation consists of an examination of the exterior of the body, just to look for any evidence of a fight or scuffle that might have left marks on the hands or the face. Those have been negative so far. The second part of the external examination has been to carefully examine the bullet wound on the back of the head to, one, ascertain whether or not it is indeed a bullet wound, two, to ascertain what the range of fire is. It's quite apparent due to the blowing apart of the skin tissue over the bullet hole and the presence of dark black gunpowder residue inside the wound that this is a hard contact. The muzzle of the gun was held against the back of the head, execution style, if you will. In the course of this investigation, we found a fragment of bullet jacket that has peeled off right at the margin of the entrance wound being a small circular hole in the scalp, about 11 millimeters in diameter. The bullet is still inside the head, and the next phase of this investigation is to open the body, examine for evidence of other injuries, obtain specimens for toxicological analysis. We are also interested in whether there are any drugs in this individual, such as cocaine. And the other aspect then is to rule out, or rule in for that matter, the presence or absence of natural disease.
Through the autopsy, the medical examiner seeks to reconstruct the events of and the circumstances surrounding the death. Because the execution style of the shooting, which he has already noted, suggests a drug involvement, he particularly looks for indications of drug use. The lymph nodes around the gallbladder are often enlarged in heroin addicts. He is concerned with this and with the gallbladder bile, a rich source for detecting drugs and establishing the narcotics profile of the body. Even though the head wound points to murder, the medical examiner checks the heart and the other organs to eliminate disease as a cause of death. And indeed, in this case, his autopsy report will show that in the heart he will discover 3 rather severe blood clots, and he will remove heart sections for microscopic examination for disease, even though he may suspect that the clots were possibly related to the head wound. He finds that the right lung has a pronounced hemorrhage and weighs 900 grams, consistent with a head wound when blood flowed from the skull through the nostrils to that lung. The left lung, with no hemorrhage, weighs only 400 grams. To document other possible abnormalities and the presence or absence of drugs and alcohol in the body, the medical examiner takes samples of each organ, both for microscopic examination of the tissue and toxicology testing. The liver is particularly useful in toxicology, but it is essential in any such study that the tissues be thoroughly clean and stored in sterile containers, free of possible contamination.
Of course, one of the key portions of this autopsy is to examine the interior of the head and remove the bullet, which is a vital piece of evidence, and also to examine the pathway of the bullet to determine which way it went. We know already it's going from back towards the front, but we want to know the direction. So here's the bullet, the main mass. There's the piece that was missing that we found at the original entry wound. So this is a small bullet. It looks almost like it's a hollow point 380 automatic, something like that. Along the bullet pathway, I found this plug of bone that the bullet had punched out from the rear of the skull. So the bullet went in the back, went straight through, Up here, it struck bone and was deflected forward for about an inch to end up in the brain tissue as we see here. Now that the bullet has been recovered, the major part of this autopsy is completed. Well, the autopsy is the first step. Secondly, after that, there are toxicology tests to be run. There are special bacteriological tests when appropriate. And then, of course, there's the routine microscopic slides to be examined.
Here, the medical examiner confirms his assessment of the status of the organs which he examined visually during autopsy. Meanwhile, the other organ samples are sent to be examined at the forensic science laboratory. Here, a toxicologist is using a computerized gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. If there is only 1/1,000,000th of a gram of cocaine in this extract from a victim's liver, he will be able to detect it. The machine will vaporize the extract and separate its components into their individual molecules. By seeing how the molecular weights show up, the toxicologist is able to deduce how much cocaine was in the body. Does a urine sample contain opiates? The technician adds serum, which will react only with opiates. This instrument measures the reaction and prints out an indication of the drugs present. Are barbiturates also present? Their components will show up on a thin chromatograph test after a diffusing solvent has transported them up the plate to different points. Reagents make each pattern visible, indicating which components are there. Through tests like these, the toxicologists build up the drug profile of the body. In the forensic science laboratory, they also analyze the items sent in from a crime scene. This appears to be blood. But is it human blood? Evidence which could ultimately link a suspect with a homicide. To test for human blood, the serologist adds human blood antiserum to an extract of the sample and to other control fluids. This serum reacts only with human blood. The test shows up positive in the right tube and the left control sample, merely as a faint division between the liquids. This positive result leads to a whole new field of analysis, because human blood contains many individual genetic components or factors which today can be identified. The particular combination of these factors varies among different groups of people.
The newest type of equipment which we use helps us to identify genetic factors which are found on enzymes and proteins inside the red cell and also in the liquid part of the blood. And these particular techniques are known as electrophoresis.
Here, a technician is preparing a chemical gel to a uniform thickness for an electrophoresis analysis to separate the different protein and enzyme genetic factors in a blood sample. The greater the number of factors that can be found in a particular sample, the more specifically will the individual genetic combination of that blood be known. And as the particular combination of the blood sample is more specifically known, the number of people it could have come from narrows down.
Theoretically, we should be able to identify a blood sample occurring in one person out of the world's population. Practically, it depends upon how much sample we have. With an average complement of genetic factors which we determine routinely, we should be able to identify approximately 1 out of 600.
This serologist is preparing a dried blood sample for electrophoresis. She sets it, together with control samples, in the previously prepared chemical gel. When an electric field is applied to the gel, the different genetic factors move across it at various rates because their molecules have different charges. This is the result, a series of PGM-AK factors, part of the genetic fingerprints of blood. The central pattern might occur in only 1 out of 30 people. If this and other results were to match a suspect's blood, it would be heavily weighted evidence that the suspect was at the crime scene. the value of blood as evidence in court depends directly on how specifically it can be analyzed. Saliva left on a cigarette butt may be incriminating because nearly 8 out of every 10 people secrete an identifiable blood factor into their saliva. To find this factor, the scientist adds antiserums to the saliva samples. Then he adds known control blood factors. He centrifuges the mixtures, and from the way the results clot, he can tell what the blood factor is. Saliva evidence is less conclusive than blood evidence, but it is another circumstantial component in building a case for guilt or innocence. So is hair found at a crime scene. Different people's hair can differ in color, pigment distribution, texture, thickness, cross-section, and 20 other characteristics. This scanning electron microscope magnifies hair 40,000 times, and an expert can classify it by species of origin and race. But hairs, even in the hands of an expert, cannot be conclusively matched. Like saliva traces, hair is good circumstantial evidence, but not positive identification. But fingerprints are absolute identification. It's a matter of finding if prints recovered at a crime scene match any in the files. This laser scanner isolates possible matches. But finally, it depends on the human eye, training, and experience. A positive fingerprint identification is crucial in court. It proves beyond doubt that this particular person was at the scene. But just being at the scene doesn't prove that this suspect committed the crime. If a bullet fired at a crime scene can be matched to one fired from a suspect's gun, it's a different story. Using a comparison microscope, this ballistic expert is examining 2 bullets. The barrel of a gun is rifled into a spiral of grooves and ridges, which leave unique marks on the bullets that it fires. The marks on 2 bullets fired from the same gun will be as alike as 2 prints from the same finger. A match like this between 2 bullets should always be accepted as definitive evidence at a trial. If there is gunpowder residue left around a bullet hole, it can be removed. Treated, the pattern shows up. Its shape and spread tell how far away the gun muzzle was. The tightness of the pattern shows conclusively that this was a contact shot, evidence about how the murder was done. Taken further, the powder residue is magnified with an electron microscope. The character of these particles could lead to a particular batch of ammunition sold at a particular place on a particular day.
So the instrumental attack to the problem is helping enormously because it takes the judgment, the necessity for exercising judgment away from an analyst, and it gives him extremely deep and penetrating powers of observation through these instruments, which allow him then to make a solid identification of a substance.
While scientists build up the physical evidence, the police try to identify and pick up a suspect. Sometimes, enough information can be gotten from witnesses to sketch an impression. After the arrest, the incriminating evidence will be used in building a case against the accused man.
I've already.
Okay, what's the card number?
Oh, you did? Department Order 485. That's right. No, I've already done that. Sign here.
Thank you. Let's go.
The arrested man's prints will be compared with any found at the crime scene, as will his blood, saliva, and hair. Bullets from the crime scene will be compared with ones fired from any gun he might possess. Forensic science rarely helps in the actual finding of an unknown suspect, but when he is found, it can prove whether or not he was at the scene and whether or not he fired the gun. It is expert testimony in court that is the payoff for forensic scientists when they present their evidence for the judicial system to decide guilt or innocence.
The role of the medical examiner in court is usually to furnish certain types of evidence in the form of expert opinion. The most common role is to answer this question: what is the cause of death? The cause meaning what type of injury led to the death. The court's trying to decide whether or not it's a homicide and who's guilty. It's the medical examiner who says that the victim died of the gunshot wound as opposed to any other supposition.
My people, my scientists and my technicians who are getting into court, I feel that they more than likely get some pleasure out of taking significant physical evidence into a court and clearing away a lot of the nonsense of testimony by presenting an item and then by presenting significant, specifically identifying information about that item.
Even more effective ways of studying and identifying evidence are being devised here at Aldermaston in England, at the only National Forensic Science Research Laboratory in the world.
We develop a technique here. We then test it out on casework. We produce a method which the operational forensic scientist can use. We then issue it to the forensic scientist for use. And additionally, we build up the data background so that he can say to the court, 5,000 cases have been done by this method, and this is a unique identification, 1 in 5,000. We have found that whereas an expert used to go to court and give his opinion based upon his own experience and integrity, he is now using the experience of his fellow workers, which has been validated, and he is quoting that in court. So that the important thing then becomes, is the data bank accurate? We ensure the accuracy and the relevance, we store it, and then the next job is to make that available to the forensic scientists, not only throughout England, but throughout the world, which is what we're now moving into, computerized data banks and international communications.
At Aldermaston, they try to devise machines to test large numbers of samples quickly and accurately. This machine automatically tests a continuous flow of blood samples for the basic factors A, B, AB, O, and RH negative and RH positive. The machine adds reagents to each sample, decants the reactions, and measures the results. Further work on blood, on the genetic and the environmentally acquired factors, could lead to identifying any one person in the world's population by their blood.
The identification of people from spots of their own blood is more definitive, in fact, than the identification you can normally make from a photograph, because the blood contains the genetic information of its origin and also the antibody information of all the small diseases that that person has gone through their lifetime. So that my twin daughters, who were identical when they were born some 15, 16 years ago, now have different blood patterns merely because one of them has had chicken pox and the other one has had mumps and one had influenza when the other one didn't have it. And all the antibodies to those diseases are recorded, contained, and ready and available in each other's blood. They are therefore, in minute detail, different.
Here at Aldermaston, they are also doing research in many other forensic science fields. Free from the pressures of routine casework, researchers have the time and money to look to the future and speculate on how it will shape up.
I would think that what in fact will happen is the communications will improve. The apparatus that we're using will get smaller and smaller and become more portable. And I can visualize, in fact there are already some in existence now, mobile forensic science laboratories which will go to the scenes of important crimes such as assassinations and murders and will in fact carry out the job on the spot.
Yet even as such advances are speculated on in England, in the United States, the number of murders has doubled in the last 15 years, and the percentage solved is slipping. And these official figures do not necessarily reflect what is really happening. For outside the particular jurisdictions shown in this film, there can be appalling inadequacies in dealing with death. There are areas in the United States where incompetent medical examiners fail to detect murder wounds, where coroners with no medical knowledge certify the cause of death, where homicides pass as accidents or natural causes.
Yes, there are horror stories. There are a number of them. The profession talks about it. They talk to each other in anguish, but they never discuss it in public. I hear about it. They tell me about it. They tell each other, but the public will not know.
There are islands of excellence, and there are islands and regions or deserts of very poor service or none at all. It's extremely spotty. It's variable depending upon personalities involved, upon financial support, upon the ancillary services, because a medical examiner cannot operate in a vacuum.
It adds up to the situation in which the medical legal investigation of death is undoubtedly improperly investigated in many situations.
There are police jurisdictions in which physical evidence at a crime is not effectively collected, where laboratory tests are wrongly, badly, or inadequately performed, where the innocent are convicted and the guilty go free.
Now, on a national basis, it's pathetic what's going on out there in a lot of places. They have untrained people doing it, and they only do it by accident. They don't know how to routinely and systematically work a scene, find the evidence, properly record it, collect it, and get it in properly to the laboratory where it can be evaluated. Unless the mayor kills the governor or the chief of police or something, the physical evidence items are not going to be worked on. It's too far to a crime laboratory, or the people are not accustomed to using them, so they don't do it. No, sir, I wouldn't say that crime laboratories are up to a reasonable standard at all. We are not up to acceptable standards in this laboratory, and we feel we have quite a strong laboratory. But there are some areas of the work where we're not doing good enough work to suit ourselves.
Knowledgeable individuals state that if every laboratory was tested on all the types of evidence on the crime laboratory proficiency testing program we performed 3 years ago, the knowledgeable individuals indicate that there would have been a 50% failure nationwide. It means that the laboratories are having problems in the analysis of evidence, and this is undoubtedly a result of misinterpretation of the test results due to carelessness, lack of training, inadequate or improper methodologies, the use of mislabeled or contaminated standards, or the lack of adequate standard spectra.
There is no general system of certification, checks, reviews, or accepted standards for forensic science in this country. And even where crime scene work, detection, and scientific analysis might be at its best, the murder solution rate barely holds steady in the face of what appears to be an increasingly violent society. Why is this? To answer such a question, we need to know more about what leads people to murder.
We should be concerned as to why people are injured, not just that they are injured, but why did they get in that condition? What can we do to prevent it?
If we knew the causes of murder, we might be able to prevent some killings from occurring, rather than only being able to clean them up after they happen. But can we understand what leads to murder before there is a body to examine, before there is any physical evidence to analyze? What do we really know?
In Western cultures, most of the murderers are men. I think the ratio is something 9 to 1. In the United States, 52% of the known murderers, that is, persons who've been caught, have performed the murders, accomplished the murders under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Victims are neighbors, family members, familiar persons, usually, rarely strangers.
I mean, we know lots about murderers as a total group. We know murder tends to occur more often in the age groups between 16 and 24, where we have a high violence group. We also know that murder is more likely to occur in lower socioeconomic classes. We understand that murder is more likely to happen in people who have had disruptive backgrounds and family lives, or have been the subjects of a child abuse or assault themselves.
I spent 14 years in the state orphanage there, which was the longest of anybody ever staying there. And it was during my period there that I was raped twice before I was 10 years old. I do hate to use the orphanage system as a crutch because I also failed to use my own God-given intelligence. But I was pushed 14 years there, being raped, being brutally treated through the corporal punishment system, never having anyone to cry to, or I never knew what the meaning of love was, but these all sound like excuses, and I have no excuse for not using my God-given intelligence.
There was considerable child abuse in my family, primarily imposed upon myself. I had made numerous trips to hospitals for multiple lacerations, burns, and bruises. I was taken away from my parents for a short period of time and ultimately returned to them again for continued abuse.
Statistics show that 60% of convicted murderers relate a history of child abuse. 50% come from broken homes. 65% never finished high school. And 70% of convicted murderers lived at or below the poverty line. Murder certainly seems to be most associated with those who live in economic, social, and emotional poverty.
Where is our crime? It's where poor people live. Who are its perpetrators? Poor people. Who are its victims? Poor people, overwhelmingly. Poor people struggling within the limits of their condition as the rest of the society in more opportune circumstances struggles. Violence, a greater necessity to have your way among poor. Certainly, there can be no question, if you really care to examine the facts, that American urban poverty dehumanizes in a very particular way.
Black people make up a large proportion of inner-city populations, where the deprivations associated with murder are most concentrated. And 50% of all murders in this country are black people killing black people.
There's a certain element of type of homicide involving blacks where it's a social economic factor and a cultural factor. If you have a child raised in a family where he does not know who his father is, where the next meal is a problem, where the entire neighborhood is poor, not poor in a monetary sense, but poor in a social sense, this is going to evolve.
It would be a cruel compounding of injustice after having imposed all that inequality and disadvantage on blacks to then say that they have a higher propensity inherently for murder.
But it certainly points out something that we have to think about from a societal standpoint, that there is a group that is murdering itself at a greater rate than other groups, and we need to look at the causes there as well.
The stability of every society in history that's known stability has depended upon the resignation of the poor to their own poverty. But our poor are not going to be resigned to their poverty. They're constantly exposed to our materialism, to our affluence. They see on television how we love things, new cars, fancy clothes, and all the rest. And there's no way that they're not going to want to share in our value patterns.
But at the moment, the levels they can attain are rarely those of the American middle-class dream. And frustration can turn to outrage, destruction, and violence.
It's because in America, the dominant culture glorifies the power of violence and ignores its pity that our subcultures are so often driven to violence. You got these kids now. You've got this woman you married and you love her, and you've lost your job. And you're the man, and this is a macho society. And it's going to be hungry before the weekend. And what are you going to do? And the frustration of it, building up, the shame of standing in unemployment line or, going down to the labor hall and hoping you'll be laid on for a little odd work here and there, on and on, tears you down.
We do see in people who murder not a spontaneous, sudden discharge that leads to a murder, nor, on the opposite extreme, premeditated, carefully planned murder. But before the murder or the assault, there are factors of stress in their lives and of increased drinking, increased quarreling, and an interesting fact, talking about murdering somebody, which is often not thought serious, but is in our studies. And what I call lethal situation develops, in which two people are likely to engage in assault and battery against each other, and that increases greatly the likelihood of murder, because murder is one of the outcomes.
I think there's no question that there is a build-up phase in which anxiety and tension and pathological jealousy and all kinds of strong emotions begin to accumulate. And then this may lead to an action phase. And this action phase very often is a very dangerous phase. People use drugs or alcohol or some other substance to avoid the action phase or escape, get in the car and drive away, go to another state, get away from the intended victim. But there's no question that there's this large buildup of anxiety and tension and passion and urgency and grudging hatred and feelings of intimidation and pathological jealousy.
Everything escalates in life, especially in crime. I had gone through all forms of breaking and entering, stealing of cars, carrying a knife, carrying a pistol. It only became a matter of time before I began to use the pistol and a rifle, whatever weapon may have been, for robbing gas stations or whatever it may be. I can very clearly remember the first armed robbery I pulled. I can probably say I was much more scared than the person that I was pointing the gun at. But the money was good. The money bought me a car. The money bought me clothes. I never sat back and thought for one moment that at some point this very gun is either going to kill somebody and give me a life sentence or somebody else is going to kill me.
Almost anybody under certain conditions could act in such a manner as to kill somebody. Certainly, what's coming from the perspective that I'm presenting, most of us could be in a situation in which we could act assaultively, and that could end up in murder, even though that wasn't our intent.
I believe any man, woman, or child on this earth can kill.
No. There is no such thing as a murderer until the act is committed. Before the act, there is no murderer. The act is what makes the murderer, so we're all qualified for it.
I knew I was out of control. I knew that somewhere, someone along the line was going to have to stop me. When the shooting started, there was a woman that was shot. She laughed at me when I was holding the weapon. And I have stated before and stated again, I have no recollection of the mental order coming from my brain to my finger to squeeze. I was surprised when the weapon discharged. The woman fell dead. There was a customer in the store. He was shot in my attempt to flee. That's all I wanted to do then was to run, get away. Hopefully I could wake up and this was a dream. I ran into a couple of police officers shortly down the road. There was much more shooting there. I was arrested the following day, and I have admitted to very few people, one myself, I breathed a sigh of relief when I was arrested. It was over. All the running and everything, the shooting, the harm, the violence was over.
And the night that I arrived back, the three of us got an automobile and went 3 miles away to a local town next to us, Newton, where in Nevada. I mean, Forster said he knew the right house where this gambler was. We wound up in the wrong house. We wound up in the home of an attorney, Waltham Quinton. And while in this here house, hysteria set in, surely on my part, as well as on the people's part in this house. There was 5 people in the house, and Attorney Waltham jumped me where I had this gun in my hand, and during the struggle, the gun went off, and Attorney Waltham was dead before he hit the floor. I don't think I could put into words the feeling of a shot when it went off, what it did to me. I can only relate what happened, what I did. I ran 4 miles from that house straight into a cordon all the way down to Watertown Square in 7 inches of snow. I was right out of my mind. When the police confronted me in Watertown Square in a cordon of 6 automobiles, I totally gave myself up and repeatedly admitted my guilt.
So far as we can tell from all the various demographic categories which exist, it would appear that there is no relationship between the availability of guns and murder.
People kill people. Availability of guns assists people in killing people. Readily available guns, which are cheap and easily obtained, assist the process.
Polls show that between 4 and 8 million Americans have used firearms successfully for defense against person. Opinions differ considerably about the gun. It would depend on whether it was a male or a female, what size hand, and so on. A .22 caliber can be quite useful to a woman. Larger bore is going to have more stopping power. It frequently would be either unloaded with a clip nearby or even loaded with access limited to yourself or your loved one.
I think the National Rifle Association serves the cause of criminal conduct and violence in the most shameful way. Guns are more than the symbol of violence in our society. They are the instrument of violence. If you take our last year, for which we now have full police statistics that we can analyze, 98% of the officers murdered in the line of duty were murdered with guns. Handguns were the principal weapon, and better than 2/3, 70%. We don't have to have that. Other societies don't have that. Only America knows this madness.
One of the biggest problems we have is too many promises being given, promises that cannot be fulfilled. The people are taught to perceive themselves as having been put down, as having been deprived, and are also taught that all they have to do is carry out some magic function, get an additional year of education, whatever, and by some magic, everything will go away and improve. All the bad things will go away and improvement will come about. I think it's very dangerous to promise more than we can deliver.
Due to the monetary problems in society today, I think more people are going to steal and continue to steal. People see their politicians stealing. They see their president stealing. Who then do they look up for? Years ago, you look up to your sports figures as heroes. Now you read in the paper your sports figures are getting caught selling cocaine to people. Who's your heroes now?
We're a very brilliant nation. I'm sure that we can put efforts, all of us, the convict as well as the big citizen, as well as its state government, federal government, what have you. All of us become involved and serve community where its needs are instead of going up to the moon or going over to Vietnam where we lost 56,000 kids over there. There must be some way we can do it right here in our own backyard, clean it up.
Inherently, murder is the ultimate human tragedy, as violence is the ultimate human degradation. And therefore, it tells you quite a bit about the values, the interests, the concerns of a society when they're constantly intrigued by murder. It would be a happy place that was intrigued by the methodology of eliminating the possibility of murder.